If there is no evidence to support the chemical imbalance theory of depression and a serotonin deficiency, why is it that so many people think that there is, and why are so many people on these drugs?
So that's a very good question. And the answer primarily is because of the efforts of the pharmaceutical industry from the 1990s onwards. So the chemical imbalance theory of depression was first constructed in the 1960s by psychiatrists and researchers who were experimenting with various drug treatments for depression and trying to come up with a justification for using drug treatment in this situation. But it wasn't an enormously well-known or popular theory at that time. There was a big project set up to test whether there were any differences in people's brain chemicals, people who had depression versus people who didn't, in the 1980s. That didn't come up with anything. So, the theory wasn't really getting anywhere. But then in the 1990s, when the pharmaceutical industry wanted to promote their new range of drugs for emotional problems, that is the SSRIs, they picked up this theory and widely promoted it. And so there were massive advertising campaigns that told people that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance, or sometimes they'd say it might be caused by a chemical imbalance. But this was repeated so many times that basically people became convinced it was true.
Yeah. This idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, I think that idea has become so widespread that it's now taken as fact.
Absolutely.
It's not just, that's a theory. I think the general public, or much of the general public, believe this to be true. And so your work for many years, including your brand new book, Chemically Imbalanced, The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth, I think is really helpful, not only for the public, but also for professionals like me, other medical professionals who potentially have felt intuitively there's something not quite right here. But I think what you've done is give people the evidence for that.
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
I should say the lack of evidence for that.
Yeah. So this is exactly why we set out to do the serotonin review, because I became aware that most of the general public think that the link between serotonin and depression is an established fact. They think it's proven. They don't realise that it's a speculation, a theory that, that there may be a bit of evidence for and a bit of evidence against. So that's why I thought, right, we need to look at the evidence properly, set it out, get it published and see what it says. And I think, as you say, that actually a lot of clinicians had been persuaded that maybe this was true too, even though there was, there was no convincing body of evidence ever put together to say, yes, this is definitively the case.
Yeah, it's interesting. In one of your chapters of this book, you write about your appearance on, I think this morning, the UK television show to talk about this. And the resident GP said on that segment, well, why does it matter? Right? Why does it matter? We know that they work. It doesn't really matter why they work. Now, it was quite shocking for me to read that, to go, it doesn't really matter why they work. Hold on a minute. There are a ton of side effects to these drugs, right? So if the whole principle upon which they're prescribed is built on sand, we kind of need to know about it, right?
Absolutely.
So what is your take on that? And what are, for anyone who's listening who perhaps is on an antidepressant at the moment, or an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, what are some of the signs that might indicate they're having some problems on them?
Yeah, so just to say first, it was a very common reaction to when we first published the serotonin paper, and also since I published the book, for psychiatrists and other leading doctors to say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how they work. And I think that is absolutely shocking. I think it matters a lot how they work. And it is absolutely essential that we discuss this with the public and so that people are able to evaluate what they might be doing to them if they're thinking about taking one of these drugs. So SSRIs, the idea was that they would work by correcting an underlying serotonin deficiency. And it turns out that actually the evidence for that is weak, inconsistent, and not compelling, and certainly not proven. But they are, they are drugs. They do change the normal state of your brain chemistry. They do modify our biology in some way, and we know that they cause, that they change people's thinking and feeling processes. And one of the common effects they have, for example, is that they cause a state of emotional numbing. So people often say that they can't, they may not feel quite so sad anymore, but also they can't feel happy anymore, and they can't cry. And some people might welcome that effect, but a lot of people report that it's actually quite unpleasant, and they don't feel like themselves anymore when they're in that sort of state.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was reading your book and diving into your work, Joanna, I reflected a lot on my own practice over the years as a medical doctor. And I've always believed that one of the most important things that a doctor can give a patient is a sense of agency and autonomy. And I feel that by overly labeling people and making them think that they can only get better if they're dependent on a medication, which they can't then stop, I've always had a deep, an ethical issue with that. And I remember early in my days as a GP, there was one patient, I don't think I started an SSRI on her. I think she'd been started it by a colleague of mine, but she came in for her 4-weekly review, right? And she was a young lady, I think she was about 23 years old. And I remember her saying to me something to the effect of, well, yeah, I don't feel as low as I did 4 weeks ago, but I feel nothing anymore. I don't feel high. I don't feel joy. I feel nothing. So I always remember that so well. I thought, that's really interesting. She's potentially having what you're calling this emotional numbness or emotional blunting. And I thought, well, how is that helpful? Yeah, you could argue we've removed the really low moods, but if you can't experience pleasure or joy or hope or whatever it might be, I thought, how is this helpful? Yeah. So that's one case I really remember super, super well. And the other case I remember really, really well is, without going into the young lady's history, I remember seeing someone and I thought, yeah, these symptoms are consistent with what we get told we need to hear in order to make the diagnosis of depression. And I remember looking in the BNF. So for people listening to the show all around the world, so the British National Formulary. So our kind of Bible of drugs and the consequences, what the indications are, what the side effects are. And I remember looking through it. And I knew this anyway, but I was just looking through it. And although it's documented as a rare side effect, I was looking at it going, oh, there's an increased risk of suicidal ideation. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense to me. I've got someone in front of me with low moods, and I'm potentially going to be putting her on a drug that, yes, it might be a small risk, that may increase her risk of suicidal thoughts. And I thought, this doesn't kind of make any sense. So any comments on what I've just said, Joanna?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so it comes back to there being, two very different ways of understanding what these drugs might be doing. And if you understand that they are correcting an underlying abnormality, an underlying deficiency, then it sounds like a good idea to take them. And you might take a small increased risk of something if you're correcting, an underlying biological disease that you have.
Yeah, but, so just on that. So if you have an infection, for example, which is, a pneumonia, right? Which is really, really bad, and you can't get over it, fevers, productive sputum, all this kind of stuff, you may decide to take an antibiotic knowing that you may get side effects, right? Yeah. So I'm just trying to draw the analogy, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
But you think that the benefits outweigh the risks.
Yes, exactly. But if it's not the case that there's an underlying abnormality, and that's what we've shown, and you are taking something that changes your the normal state of your brain and your normal feelings and thoughts and behaviors because of that, then then the idea that actually some of these changes might be quite negative, like you might get some suicidal thoughts, you might have your emotions, including positive emotions, blunted, you might feel lethargic a lot of the time, you are very likely to have sexual dysfunction, at least while you're taking the drug, possibly afterwards. Then all these things actually become much more important. They're not just incidental. They're part of weighing up whether actually this is a good idea.
Yeah, and going back to your TV segment where the other doctor said, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If they work, they work. We don't need to know the reasons. Yeah. Well, these are pretty significant side effects. Yes. Of course, we need to know the reasons before we put people on them.
Absolutely. And I think, I think many people will make a different decision if they're presented with something that's supposed to, correct your serotonin deficiency, or they're presented with something that's going to numb you a bit, like having a drink of alcohol or something like that, numb you temporarily. Many people, I think, will decide, actually, no, I don't want that. I can get through this myself. I don't want to be numbed. I don't want to be drugged.
Do you know how common it is in the UK? How prevalent is the prescriptions of antidepressants? Or do you know how many people are on them currently in the UK?
So the estimate is about 17% or a little bit more of the population. So almost 1 in 5 are taking them at the moment. Those are figures from about 2017. That's including, I think that's I think that's the population of over 18s.
So over 18, so maybe 1 in 5 adults in the UK are on some form of antidepressant.
And it's more for women. So 23% of women take them. So almost 1 in 4 women are taking an antidepressant.
And do we know under the age of 18 how common it is? Because I understand that more and more adolescents are being prescribed these things.
I don't have precise figures for younger people, but you're absolutely right. The rates of prescribing are rising. I feel like when I'm talking to my children and their friends that, a lot of their group are on antidepressants, sometimes other sorts of medication, but a lot of them are taking antidepressants.
It's really interesting to me. Last week, Suzanne O'Sullivan was here in the studio, and she's written another very important book, The Age of Diagnosis, where she questions many things to do with how many people are being diagnosed with a variety of different conditions, including depression. It's kind of interesting how these books are coming out in, at similar times. Right? I feel that there's a sense within society, certainly within the medical profession, that, wait a minute, something we're doing isn't working very well. And my feeling is that we're trying to medicalize a lot of, frankly, normal or the variety of symptoms that people experience in their day-to-day life. Good feelings, bad feelings, struggles, positive emotions, negative emotions. These things are part of the human condition. No,
I absolutely agree. And the ways it's negative is, there are a number of ways. When you give someone a label, a diagnostic label, you often cease to see the individual and their individual problems, and you're then treating the label. And actually what we need to do is see people as individuals, and people do struggle with their emotions. I think sometimes we're maybe unnecessarily medicating people who are having, fairly normal reactions, but people vary in their reactions, and some people will react to difficult circumstances more extremely than other people and will struggle with that. But nevertheless, I don't think it helps to say, to treat this as a diagnosis, to label everyone, because then you don't actually uncover what the real problems are that need to be addressed.
We mentioned this term SSRI quite a bit. Okay, so first of all, I'd love you to expand upon, the common names that people, or the drug names that people may be taking or may have heard of, which fall under that category. And then if possible, Joanna, it'd be really good to understand, what did the trials actually show? Okay, because you're saying that this serotonin chemical imbalance theory is got minimal evidence to support it, But nonetheless, 1 in 5 of the UK population, at least probably, and because that was 2017.
Yeah.
Mental health has got a lot worse in the last few years.
Yes.
There was COVID, there was lockdowns, right? So it could well be more than that now.
Yes.
On what evidence was the prescription of these drugs even based upon in the